About ready to get started then?
I'm ready when you're.
Submit your vouchers.
I'm ready. I was here for that. No, I was here. No, I wasn't here Saturday. I was here Friday night, then Saturday. Through this morning, I was just able to put, and then now I'm here. So.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Great to see you all here. My name's Nicole. I'm just going to do a couple announcements before we get started. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the History Center YouTube channel. So just Google York County History Center for the recording. We do have some folks watching from home on Zoom. Couple upcoming programs to round out the year. We have our Writers Roundtable coming up on December 4th. The speaker is Scott Dicely, who will be speaking about the new Crispus Attucks History and Culture Center and the progress they're making with construction of that in York. December 5th is First Friday and also Light Up Night, and we'll be having holiday tours of the Gates and Plow Tavern, Gates House and Plow Tavern. December 7th is our members holiday party for History Center members. And December 11th is History Storytellers program featuring local historians. So lots going on, and I think we can take a break for the holidays. For more information, please visit yorkhistorycenter.org. Thank you. And Scott.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening again, and thank you that you've come to the last meeting of 2025's Civil War Roundtable campaign. We're thankful for all those who have attended throughout the year, virtually and in person. And we also want to extend a special thanks to the History Center for all their support. Without their help, this program would not be possible. So we want to extend a special thank you to them. And also, as we look forward to next year, we have some good programs starting to be lined up. We are still looking for other speakers. If you do have someone in mind, you can get with me or Kathy after the program, and we'll try and work out some things with potential speakers. And also today, I'm not sure how many of you went to Remembrance Day today, but that was today, and I heard from one of the people here that it was a very moving occasion. So I wish I could have been there, but unfortunately I could not. But I was able to, the few days before the Remembrance Day, I attended the 30th annual Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg, which it features a variety of speakers, panels. They have author meetings and book signings, discussion sessions, and this year the Federal City Brass Band performed for us during the national anthem and other period pieces. And it concluded with the reading of the Gettysburg Address by actor Stephen Lang. So those are some of the events that I experienced this past weekend as we look toward remembering our Civil War period and this time of the Gettysburg Address. And just a reminder, as we look forward to our next programs, January and February will be online only, as we deal with potential weather issues that may prevent travel to the History Center. So we will be meeting online only via Zoom for our January and February meetings. For January, we're going to have Jim Hessler present to us. His program is called Gettysburg Little Bighorn Connections, 150th Anniversary Edition. Gettysburg and Little Bighorn are the two most written about and studied military engagements in American history. Of course, the colorful and controversial George Armstrong Custer played important roles in both battles. That Custer was only one of a handful of men who were connected to both campaigns. Since the year 2026 is the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, we'll revisit these two legendary battles and learn the fates of the men who linked them together. Some survived both battles, some did not. Jim Hessler is a historian, author, licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park, where he's been interpreting the battle since 2003. He's the author or co-author of 4 books on the campaign: Sickles at Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, Gettysburg Peach Orchard, and his most recent release, The First Day at Gettysburg, released earlier this year. His work has earned several distinguished book awards, and he has also published articles in respected outlets such as Gettysburg Magazine. Beyond his publications, he has co-created and hosts popular Battle of Gettysburg podcast, reaching a global audience of history enthusiasts. He's appeared as a public historian in major media such as History Channel, NPR, Travel Channel, PCN TV, and in programs and content development with the American Battlefield Trust. And when I was at the forum this weekend, the American Battlefield Trust did receive their Wendy Allen Award for groups that help with the interpretation of the Civil War. So we can thank them for all their work as well. So tonight, as we wrap up our 2025 campaign, I want to welcome back Joe Mieczkowski. This is his 3rd appearance to the roundtable. Previous programs, he covered the New York City draft riots, and he did a living history presentation along with his wife as Secretary of War Simon Cameron and wife Margaretta. He's a retired federal executive and licensed battlefield guide for Gettysburg National Military Park. He's a past president of both the Association of Licensed Battlefield Guides and Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable. In addition, he is on the faculty of the prestigious Lincoln Leadership Institute. He has 4 books to his credit, including Lincoln and His Cabinet, and I see he has them available up on the table here for after the program. So let us now welcome Joe as he presents War is Politics by Other Means. Thanks.
I feel really privileged to be with you. I'm in this beautiful building for my first time here at the History Center, and I'm very impressed with York County and what they've done to preserve their history. And thank you for the nice introduction. And Kathy, thank you very much for all your help. But we are going to be talking about the American Civil War, and what better day to talk about the American Civil War than today, November 19th, 162nd anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. This is a special day in American history, although I'm anxious to come back here later in the year when we talk about the American Revolution and the part that York County played in the American Revolution. I'm sure there'll be lots of programs here in York County. I'm anxious to hear about those. But I am a licensed battlefield guide at the Gettysburg National Military Park. I've been a battlefield guide for almost 20 years. It's hard to believe it, but I wasn't always going to be a licensed battlefield guide. I spent most of my working life in and around Washington, D.C. as a director with the Social Security Administration, but I had a plan. My plan was to retire. I was going to go to Florida and sell orange juice. I was going to leave Washington, D.C., go to Florida and sell orange juice, but I could never concentrate. So hopefully you'll be able to concentrate a little bit on the topic tonight about the American Civil War. And in particular, we're going to be talking about how war is a mere continuation of politics by other means. And I quote by Karl von Clausewitz. This was at one point at the end of my program. Now I put it at the beginning of the program. You know, the yin and the yang, the alpha, the omega. And I think this is just important when you think about the beginning of the war, the end of the war, because the war is about politics. You know, they say that amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. Well, I think professionals study politics, because it was all about the politics of the American Civil War. And that's where I spent most of my time researching the politics of the American Civil War. I mean, how many people even remember who the military commanders were in World War II? But remember Franklin Roosevelt. How many people remember the military leaders in the Iraq-Afghanistan war? You may not remember it, but you might remember Dick Cheney. You see, in the end, it's all about politics. So we're going to be talking about politics in the American Civil War, because war is a continuation of politics by other means, as Clausewitz would say, and once is ready to a roof. Now, we are going to be talking about politics, and if you want to understand politics, there's some pretty good books out there about understanding Civil War politics. Now, this is not a trick question, but what's the most popular Civil War book ever written? Now, The Team of Rivals, right? Some people will say the Battle of Gettysburg, some people will say Antietam, Chickamauga. The most popular book ever written about the American Civil War was by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, where she talked about the politics, and in particular, the politics in Lincoln's administration. And we're going to be talking about it a little bit tonight. And you tell me that recently in Gettysburg, Doris Kearns Goodwin was there. Do you want to just tell that story?
Well, we were supposed to have Peggy Noonan speak at the gala a couple of weeks ago. 2 days before the gala, she called up and canceled. So they scrambled and they talked to her agent, who said, "Let me see what I can do." And he called back and said, "Doris Kearns Goodwin will do it."
Yeah.
So she came in and it was a Q&A with our vice chairman about the book. Obviously, that was the basis for the movie Lincoln. She talked about that, told some stories about the actors and the people on it, and it was she's an amazing woman.
Yeah, she's amazing, but I felt her book fell short, so I put out my own book. They're kind of filling some blanks that I thought were missing in the story of Team of Rivals. So I have a companion book called Lincoln and His Cabinet. That's where we'll put some of our focus today. On Team of Rivals, some of the people that were in Lincoln's cabinet, and you know their names, Secretary of State William Seward and Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase. So some of those names are familiar to us, but there were an awful lot of people in Lincoln's cabinet whose names are not as familiar, who were also very, very influential. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. You know, some of the names that are footnotes in American history or names that have just been lost to our understanding the American Civil War. It's got to be about more than Lee and Meade and Grant and Lincoln, right? It's all about the people behind the screen, you know, that were pulling the levers. And that's where my interest is. So let's see if we can get you interested as we talk about this. This is Lincoln's cabinet. Just to refamiliarize yourself with some of these names. You've got Montgomery Blair, who's familiar with that name, right? What did Montgomery Blair do in the Lincoln administration? Postmaster General. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was a big deal then, getting the mail out. There were 23,000 post offices in this country when the Civil War came. He had some big responsibilities, making sure people can communicate with each other in the days before, you know, texts and email. And then you had Caleb Smith. He was the Secretary of the Interior. What does the Secretary of the Interior do in 1863? Deal with the American Indians, right? So they had a lot on their plate. Who else is in there? Salmon P. Chase. Salmon P. Chase was the Secretary of the Treasury, the money. We'll talk more about him. William Seward, who was the Secretary of State. Simon Cameron, one of my most interesting politicians, maybe the most important politician that Pennsylvania ever produced. Simon Cameron. He was not only a four-term United States Senator, but he was also Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration, although many people have lost sight of that. And he was an important person. Edward Bates, who was the Attorney General, and Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy. So these are the people that were in Lincoln's cabinet. We're going to talk a little bit about them and answer some questions, and maybe you can pose some questions. So let's talk about the Gettysburg Address. You know, we'll start with the Gettysburg Address. I don't ordinarily do it, but this is a special day, right? November 19th. So we're going to be talking about the Gettysburg Address, and then we'll relate it back to some of the people that were in Lincoln's cabinet. Who was here in Gettysburg, so to speak, and who wasn't here, and why weren't they? Right, so let's talk about what happened here. Now, the Gettysburg Address is on November 19th, 1863. So at a cabinet meeting prior to Abraham Lincoln coming to Gettysburg, he would talk to his cabinet and ask the people, I'm going to go to Gettysburg to make a speech, who would like to come along? And a lot of the cabinet members, you know, said that we're really too busy to want to come along. Other people said we will come along. But in any case, he left for the event on Wednesday, and on Thursday, November 19th, 1863, he was at the ceremony. We'll talk more about all of that. He told the cabinet of his plans and asked, if you're in the cabinet, if you're in this meeting, you know, who can come to the ceremony? I'd like as many of you as possible to come. Some of them did not come because they wanted to be the president of the United States, and they would run against Lincoln in the next presidential election. So some of these cabinet members, people like Salmon P. Chase, were actively working to undermine Lincoln. So the last thing they wanted to do was come to Gettysburg with him while he gets the spotlight because they wanted their own spotlight. All right. However, the people that did accompany him were the Secretary of State, William Seward, Montgomery Blair, and the Secretary of the Interior, John Usher, who had replaced Caleb Smith later in the war. And we'll talk more about John Usher, another name that's been lost to history. So the Gettysburg Address, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the story. Abraham Lincoln leaves Washington, D.C. on November 18th. He spends the night in Gettysburg at the home of local attorney David Wills. While he's at that home, which still exists in Gettysburg, he's in the bedroom upstairs finishing this speech, putting the final touches on the speech that he has already written. And a crowd outside his window, and there was a big crowd in Gettysburg on November 18th, because it was like a political rally, and they wanted Lincoln to speak. He was their champion. So they would say, Abraham Lincoln, make a speech, make a speech, make a speech. But Abraham Lincoln never spoke off the cuff. He hated speaking off the cuff. He liked to prepare his speeches. So he looked outside the window and said, rather than say something stupid, I won't say anything at all. So Abraham Lincoln will not deliver that speech the night before the speech was supposed to be delivered. So he was interrupted by a large crowd of people, some 15,000 people that were in Gettysburg on November 18th, 1863, asking him to make a speech. Next door to Abraham Lincoln, William Seward was staying at the home of a man named Robert Harper, who was the newspaper editor, a Republican newspaper editor, I should add. And so Abraham Lincoln, let's see, where do we go? There we go. Lincoln tells him, I have no speech to make. And there we go. He finishes the speech the evening of November 18th, goes next door to see William Seward and says, how do you like this speech? William Seward has his own take on what Abraham Lincoln ought to be saying the next day. In all likelihood, they made some additions or corrections to the speech that Abraham Lincoln had made. There's the David Wills house, and then next door, the Harper house. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the Wills house. How many people have seen the Wills house in Gettysburg? Almost everybody, right? You live in New York, I'm sure you get to Gettysburg. So you've seen this house. Up until recently, it was a museum. It's closed now. But next door is a building that no longer exists. It was the Harper house. The Harper house was the home of a man named Robert Harper, who was the editor of the local Republican newspaper. There were 3 different newspapers in Gettysburg at the time, a Republican, Democratic, and something in between. But since William Seward was a Republican, he stayed at the home of a Republican host, Robert Harper. And that's where they would do it. Anyway, William Seward spent the night at the home of Robert Harper on Lincoln Square. And then the other cabinet secretaries that were with Lincoln also had to find lodging in the town of Gettysburg. Montgomery Blair stayed at the home of local postmaster David Beeler. Now that's kind of interesting because Montgomery Blair's position is Postmaster General. So he needs a place to stay. He stays with the Postmaster of Gettysburg, which is an interesting position because the Postmaster of Gettysburg would have been the only federal official in the town. Now think about that, right? You don't have this big federal presence. The only person in the whole town that actually works for the federal government is the postmaster, David Beeler. So Montgomery Blair, Postmaster General, stays with him. Lincoln, John Usher, Blair, and Seward, they attended the reception at the Wills house on November 18th and 19th. Seward will be with Lincoln on November 18th, and Seward will also make his own speech. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the Gettysburg Address, but they forget that some of the other officials that were in Gettysburg for this occasion also had speeches to make. And while Lincoln was reluctant to give a speech from the window of the Wills house on November 18th, William Seward, who also coveted being president, was not reluctant to give a speech. And this is just a text from some of his speech. I believe this strife is going to end in the removal of that evil, which should have been removed by peaceful means. We shall therefore be united. So William Seward, who was once the governor of New York, who had almost beaten Lincoln for the presidential nomination, is now the Secretary of State. He too wants to be the president of the United States, but he's a good Republican, so he accompanies Lincoln to Gettysburg, but is only too anxious to make his own speech. About 11 o'clock that night, Lincoln visits Seward and finishes the draft of the Gettysburg Address. Now, this is an interesting picture. because we're talking about the Gettysburg Address, and we're talking about who was there and who wasn't there. Now, we already talked about who was in the cabinet, and this will give you some sense of who was at the Gettysburg Address. Many of you are familiar with this picture, the only known photo of Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address. But very few people take the time to look at that picture and try to understand who else is in that picture, and more importantly, who's not in the picture. So let's take a look at who's in the picture. All right, you have William Seward here. Now, that's who, it's pretty blurry, right? So how do we know that's William Seward? Well, we don't know it's William Seward. Everybody's guessing that that's William Seward. Other people have conjectured that that's not William Seward, it's Simon Cameron, and that's who I think it is. All right, who had been the Secretary of War, who was a close confidant of Abraham Lincoln, was an important Pennsylvania politician, and he would have had a place on the speaker's platform. So was it Seward or Cameron? I have my own thoughts about that. Who else is on here? Of course, Ward Lemon is on the podium, as it were. I'm not even sure that that's him either, but the graphic says that it is. Ward Lemon, who was
Ward Lemon's the one at the top hat in the center there. One toward the right of Lincoln.
to the right of Lincoln.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, all right, so maybe that's Ward Lemon. So there's a difference of opinion as to who Ward Lemon is, right? Depending on who's analyzing this photo. But most people would say that that's Ward Lemon. All right, who else is on there? Edward Everett, who was the keynote speaker. He's a little blurry too. He was probably on his way to the tent that he had set up so that, because he had incontinence problems. So he set up a little tent up there on Cemetery Hill, and he would sometimes, have to go to the bathroom. So he would leave there. I'm sure his image was blurry a lot. Who else is on here? This is interesting. You got Governor Andrew Curtin, who's at the ceremony, the governor of Pennsylvania. And then you have a lot of other governors there, Governor Todd of Ohio and Governor Seymour of New York, who was a Democrat, interestingly enough. And then you have these other people like Italian Minister Bertinati. So you have a lot, but the question is, that's sort of who was there, as best we can tell, and we're not really sure. But more importantly, who wasn't there? Salmon P. Chase. Now, the whole story of The Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin is talking about the Republican nomination for president in 1860. Right? There were several people who thought that they ought to be the president of the United States. Simon Cameron, William Seward, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, an important abolitionist, Edward Bates of Missouri. So all these people wanted to be the president of the United States. They wanted to get the Republican nomination for president. But some of them came to Gettysburg with Lincoln, but Salmon P. Chase did not. He was actively seeking to undermine Lincoln in 1863. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. He wanted to be president in the 1864 election, and he was actively working to undermine Abraham Lincoln and would not come with Lincoln to Gettysburg for the Gettysburg Address. In fact, the Treasurer of the United States, whose name was Spinning, he worked for Salmon P. Chase, and a newspaper reporter went to him and said, "Why didn't Salmon P. Chase go to Gettysburg with Lincoln? Why didn't the Secretary of the Treasury go to Gettysburg with Lincoln? After all, the Secretary of State did, Postmaster General went. Why didn't Chase go to Gettysburg with Lincoln?" And the Treasurer of the United States, his name's on all the greenbacks, right? He would later say, Salmon P. Chase did not go to Gettysburg because we believe that we should let the dead bury the dead. Now think about that. There's somebody who's actually working for Abraham Lincoln, but he's also working to actively undermine Lincoln so that he too might be president. Let the dead bury the dead. That's pretty hard stuff, right? It's hardball politics. That's something that you might see on the news today, but not what you anticipate from 1863. Chase was not in attendance. So it's interesting when you look at these pictures to think about who was there, but I think it's just as interesting to think who wasn't there. That's just one example as we talked about the Gettysburg Address. This is a really interesting painting, I think. Who knew that Norman Rockwell painted an image of Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address? Right? I mean, we're getting close to Thanksgiving. In your head, you can see the people around the table cutting the turkey. But who knew that Norman Rockwell, of all people, painted the Gettysburg Address. I just thought it was just fascinating. And the artwork people as they do. Now, I'm going to guess that's Edward Everett, but I'm not entirely sure who these other guys are. Kind of lookers on, right? Anyway, I just thought it was kind of cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, right? We just talked a little bit about the Gettysburg Address. We already know the importance of that speech delivered 162 years ago today. We talked a little bit already about team of rivals and who went to the address and who didn't go to the address, and some people were actively working to undermine Lincoln. But let's talk about Lincoln himself. All right, now we know a lot about Abraham Lincoln. We know he was born in Kentucky. We know he was a self-educated man, born in a log cabin, which is still on display in Hodgensville, Kentucky. But one thing that we forget is that even though he was later become president of the United States, even though we know he was gregarious, even though he had a great sense of humor, we forget that he was a loner. He didn't have any friends. Who were the friends of Abraham Lincoln? He associated with a lot of people, but he had almost no close friends. He was a loner, made his decisions on his own. Absolute self-confidence. Everybody in this room has more education than Abraham Lincoln did. 1 year of formal schooling. And yet he lifted himself up to the great heights that he achieved. But he was a loner. He did it by himself. He had very few friends, which is an interesting to think, but we know he's tough. Born in Kentucky, later moved to Indiana and Illinois, confident, ambitious, self-educated. As you know, an opponent of the expansion of slavery. He was willing to leave slavery alone, but he was not willing to allow it to expand. He was occupied primarily with the defeat of the Confederate States of America while he was president of the United States. But as you think about Abraham Lincoln, it's useful to understand not only what he did, but who he was. This is what people would say about Abraham Lincoln. They would say, George Templeton Strong, a New York lawyer, said that Lincoln was a barbarian, a Scythian, a Yahoo, a guerrilla, right? That's how people felt about him. This is what Henry Ward Beecher would say. He's an unshapely man. Northern newspapers called for his assassination long before John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. He doesn't have a lot of friends. He was called a coward, an idiot, a guerrilla by George McClellan, commanding general of his armies. You can see what his thinking about Lincoln was. He didn't have a whole lot of respect, certainly early on. Edwin Stanton, who later became Secretary of War, called him a clown. And William Seward called him a little lawyer from Illinois. He had very few close personal friends. He had a lot of political associations, but people who worked with him and for him didn't necessarily have a great deal of respect for him, at least not early on. And here's his best friend. He had a dog named Fido. I love that. When he lived in Springfield, Illinois, he and his family did have a dog called Fido, but when he came to Washington, D.C., he left the dog back home. I guess the kids were pretty upset about that. But he did have one friend, Joshua Speed. How many people have heard that name? Joshua Speed, perhaps Lincoln's only friend throughout his lifetime, the only close personal friend. There's Joshua Speed. They became acquainted with each other in 1837. At one point, while Abraham Lincoln was establishing his legal career, he needed a place to stay. Joshua Speed, who he became acquainted with, said, "You can stay at my house, but you're going to have to sleep in my bed." And he did for 3 years, which wasn't unusual in the time. But they became such close personal friends that later, right, these relationships become important. His brother James Speed would become the Attorney General when Edward Bates left the office. So Joshua Speed is perhaps his only important friend, and his brother James Speed would later become important in Lincoln's cabinet. But he had a lot of enemies, right? He didn't have a lot of friends, but he did have a lot of enemies, and you can probably tick them off. George McClellan, who would become his enemy, and also run against him for the 1864 presidential election. George McClellan, who had a low opinion of him. Who's that? Iris Greeley, who, the editor of the New York Tribune, you know. Today, it's all about social media. In 1863, it was all about social media, but it was about the newspapers. So every big city had any number of newspapers, and the New York Tribune had 1 million subscribers, right? In a population of 30 million. That means nearly every household in the North got a newspaper and anxiously read whatever Horace Greeley had to say. He would often drive Lincoln nuts, always pushing Lincoln to go further with emancipation. Recognize that fellow? Stephen Douglas, right? Stephen Douglas. You might remember the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas beating out for the job as United States Senator from Illinois. And then later ran against him for president in 1860. One of several people who ran against Lincoln, but would lose. Also an enemy of sorts. I don't have to tell you who that is. John Wilkes Booth. There's another one. How about that guy?
Jefferson Davis.
All right, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, formerly United States Senator, then President of the Confederate States of America, another enemy of Lincoln. The Copperheads, and then you name any number of Copperheads, right? And this is General Robert Edward Lee. So he had enemies among his own military officers. He had enemies among the Confederate military officers. He had enemies among the Northern politicians. He had enemies among the Southern politicians. This guy just didn't have a lot of friends, except Joshua Speed, perhaps. But let's talk a little bit more about his administration. So who was in Lincoln's administration? You know, we sometimes discount the vice presidents, right? Rarely talk about the vice presidents. Doris Kearns Goodwin hardly mentioned them at all, probably because they didn't do a whole lot. Right, but this was the first vice president in Lincoln's first administration, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. Now, what do you know about Hannibal Hamlin?
Abolitionist.
Pardon?
An abolitionist?
An abolitionist, absolutely. He's from a northern state, New England state, an abolitionist. Sure. Former Democrat. Okay. As were so many, right? People were switching political parties. Even Abraham Lincoln switched political parties from Whig to Republican to Union Party. Abraham Lincoln was in 3 different political parties, and we seemingly have forgotten that over time. Right? Hannibal Hamlin. He and Mary Todd Lincoln did not like each other. And, you know, while you think about Dick Cheney and even J.D. Vance, right, these people are active vice presidents. They're in the news media. They go to the cabinet meetings. They help make decisions. They're out there promoting the president's policies. But Hannibal Hamlin went back home in Maine and did almost nothing. He didn't get, you know, the job of the vice president wasn't as elevated then as it is today. Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife, didn't like him a whole lot. So he said, the heck with it. I'm not spending any time in Washington. I'm going to go back to Maine. So he became essentially a non-entity, providing little or no help to the Lincoln administration. But just a little interesting fact is that when he was a young man, he studied law in New England with a man named Samuel Fessenden. Now that name's going to become important, right? As we study politics, remember I told you about Joshua Speed, how his brother became the Attorney General? Well, Samuel Fessenden will have a son named William Fessenden, who will also enter Lincoln's cabinet. So you start to see these connections between people that Lincoln was affiliated with, people that he knew, and people that would enter his administration. So even though Hannibal Hamlin didn't do anything, his influence would bring William Fessenden into Lincoln's cabinet. Now, you know, you start digging just a little deeper below the surface. You know, what else can we learn about Hannibal Hamlin? One interesting little piece of information I learned is that he loved to play cards. Right? So you think about you learn about the culture of the 19th century, which is why this is so interesting. You know, what were people doing to amuse themselves? And a lot of people played cards. We know that about the soldiers at Gettysburg. They played dominoes and card games, but so did the politicians. And Hannibal Hamlin loved to play cards. In fact, when he was in Maine, while the Republican nomination for president was taking place in Chicago, Lincoln would suggest him as a vice president. someone would tell Hannibal Hamlin that he was going to be the presidential nominee. And he got pretty upset because he was playing the hand of cards and he was doing pretty well. Or he had a good hand of cards. But in fact, he will later die at a card table. He'll later die at a card table. This guy was into it. All right. But he had little or no relationship with Abraham Lincoln, rarely spent any time in Washington, D.C. through the Lincoln administration. And then Lincoln will later replace Hamlin in 1864 with this gentleman, Andrew Johnson. Now, what do we know about Andrew Johnson?
Bad news.
Bad news. Why bad news?
Well, he didn't support.
He certainly didn't follow Lincoln's policies after Lincoln's death.
South.
Right. He was from Tennessee, and his home is still in Tennessee. You can still visit his birthplace, known as the Tennessee Tailor. Right. So while Hannibal Hamlin played cards, he was a good. I don't want to say seamstress. There must be a male equivalent to seamstress, but
Taylor.
it was, what is it? Tailor.
Taylor.
Yeah, we'll say Taylor, right? I guess it should have been obvious, right? He was nominated for vice president in 1864 on the National Union Party ticket. Now, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Remember, I told you Lincoln was a Whig. Then he became a Republican in 1860. But when he ran for president in 1864, he did not run as a Republican, as most people imagine. He ran as a part of the Union Party. He was trying to unite the disparate factions around the country. Both all the wings of the Republican Party, some conservative, some liberal, and he would ran on the National Union Party ticket, and Andrew Johnson ran on that ticket. But there's an interesting Gettysburg connection in that General Dan Sickles, who's of Gettysburg fame, of all people, may have been responsible for Johnson's nomination. Right? Abraham Lincoln was hunting around for somebody to replace Hannibal Hamlin, and Dan Sickles will go to Andrew Johnson to kind of feel him out. Are you interested in the job? And we might say that Dan Sickles, Gettysburg hero of sorts, will be responsible for bringing Johnson into Lincoln's administration. Now, he was not Lincoln's, Johnson was not Lincoln's first choice. Dan Sickles would later help bring Johnson into it, but Abraham Lincoln's first choice for vice president was General Benjamin Butler, the Beast of New Orleans. That's who Lincoln wanted as vice president, and he sends Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania to New Orleans to feel him out. And Ben Butler says, I don't want to be the vice president. The only reason I will take the job as vice president if you can assure me that Lincoln will die or resign while he's in office.
Gosh.
All right, so Benjamin Butler says, okay, I'm not gonna do this. All right. So interesting, about the vice presidents, and just as we dig just a little deeper, learning a little bit more about them, which kind of adds meat to the bones as our understanding of Lincoln, I think. Andrew Johnson also was a drinker. The day he was to be inaugurated, he drank 3 stiff drinks of whiskey, maybe more, while he was making his acceptance speech. I guess he was slurring his words, but Abraham Lincoln defended him, saying, Andy is not a drunk. Right, so at least he had his back. Let's talk about the cabinet. I mentioned their names earlier, and there were a lot of them. Very few of the people that were originally in Lincoln's cabinet will survive the 4 years of the Lincoln administration. William Seward, however, will, once the governor of New York, would like to have been president himself, but he will remain as Secretary of State for 4 years. We'll talk more about that. The Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, later William Fessenden. Remember, we talked about that name, and then he'll be replaced by a man named Hugh McCulloch. The Secretary of War, my favorite, Simon Cameron, later replaced by an even more famous man, Edwin Stanton. Secretary of War, the Attorney General, Edward Bates of Missouri, James Speed, we already talked about his connection. Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, who will later be replaced by William Dennison. All right, Secretary of Navy, William Gideon Wells. So of all these people, how many survived the 4 years of the Lincoln administration? William Seward, Gideon Wells. There's a lot of people in and out of that, right? He's turning over his vice presidents, he's turning over his cabinet. And some of these people would just as soon have done anything other than support Abraham Lincoln because they had their own political ambitions. And then the Secretary of the Interior, Callum Smith and John Usher. So let's talk a little bit about each of them in turn. William Henry Seward of New York, sometimes referred to as the premier or the prime minister. Certainly that's the way he felt about things. Lincoln was elected in 1860. William Seward wasn't quite ready to support the little lawyer from Illinois. He imagined himself as taking the reins of government, with Lincoln, despite his title as president, taking a subservient position. He had been the governor of New York, United States senator, had the support of the news media, and was expected to have won the Republican nomination in 1860. In 1860, there was a nominating convention in Chicago at a building called the Wigwam, which I think is a really cool name for a convention center. At the Wigwam in Chicago, Illinois, there was a Republican nominating convention, and William Seward, who had gained national prominence as a abolitionist, was expected to win the Republican nomination for president. So they had a vote. All right, and they said, let's vote among our delegates who's going to get the Republican nomination for president. William Seward got a number of votes. Lincoln got a couple of votes. Simon Cameron got a couple of votes. All right, Salmon P. Chase got a couple of votes, but no one got enough votes to win the Republican nomination. So as you might imagine, in back rooms and smoke-filled rooms, they would make some deals. And the most important political deal of the century, I think, was made that no one ever heard of. And it was made by Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. Now, Simon Cameron, right, had been a United States senator. He was a rich, wealthy, and corrupt politician. They once said that in those days, there was no popular election for United States senator. You were elected by your legislature. And the word was that Simon Cameron bribed the entire Pennsylvania state legislature so that he could become a United States senator. So he had this terrible reputation as a corrupt politician. Well, he went to Chicago hoping that he would get the Republican nomination for president. He quickly became aware that he was not going to get enough votes. But he didn't want William Seward to get it either. He was on a rival of Simon Cameron's. So Simon Cameron from, Maytown, Pennsylvania, not far from here, and later from Harrisburg, would work behind the scenes with Lincoln's supporters. And the deal was, the art of the deal, Simon Cameron, right? The art of the deal. The deal was, I will give you the votes of the Pennsylvania delegation to Abraham Lincoln if he will offer me a position in his cabinet, right? That's the deal. I will give you the votes of the Pennsylvania delegation. I'll give those to Lincoln if you will give me a position in his cabinet. Well, Cameron gave Lincoln's people the votes of the Pennsylvania delegation. Lincoln goes on to defeat William Seward, a surprise victory. And then later, Lincoln now owes Simon Cameron a favor, right? So it's the deal of the century. Except for the political support of Simon Cameron, I don't think Lincoln would ever have been president. But you've got these backroom deals being conducted, right? So William Seward is deprived of that Republican nomination. However, he will, in true team of rival fashion, Lincoln will bring him into the administration, because Lincoln isn't concerned about the rivalry. He's concerned about the talent that his opponents bring to his organization. So William Seward, governor of New York, senator, later secretary of state, dominant in the Republican Party, but he will be was considered a very outspoken advocate for abolition at a point when people weren't ready to accept that. But he did become a loyal member of Lincoln's wartime cabinet. So any thoughts on William Seward? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I thought that he had such respect for Lincoln eventually that he respected him and was a friend.
Eventually.
Lincoln went to him, to review his draft.
Yes.
I think that shows trust.
Yeah, by 1863, the relationship
Yes.
is improving, and that will continue to be the case. So a one-time rival becomes a long-time supporter.
Right.
Absolutely correct.
What was the effect of purchasing Alaska?
Well, that'll come after the American Civil War. I think it's in 1867, when William Seward, still the Secretary of State under a new president, will, conduct foreign diplomacy, work with Russia to purchase Alaska. Which was, the Bering Sea separates Russia from Alaska, and while today boats can go back and forth, not so much in 1863. So Russia was anxious to get rid of it, get some American greenbacks, and William Seward was only too anxious to negotiate the deal. So William Seward, a name that's worth remembering. He would often get himself in a lot of trouble for what he had to say. Said that in the events leading up to the American Civil War, war was inevitable. There was going to be an irrepressible conflict, that there's a higher law than the Constitution. So he was criticizing the people in the Confederacy on moral grounds, which is enough to upset anybody. It'll be an inevitable conclusion. This country will be either slaveholding or free. And then, because he was such an animated speaker and such a controversial speaker, the great writer Henry Adams would say that William Seward would inspire a cow with statesmanship if she understood our language. Just like the flowery language of the 19th century. That's where William Seward lived, in Washington, D.C., across the street from the White House at Lafayette Square. As you suggest, as the war continued, Lincoln and Seward developed a much closer relationship. Lincoln would often walk across the street and spend time with William Seward. And while they weren't necessarily friends, they were certainly close political associates. Friendship's kind of a fuzzy word anyway, but Lincoln and Seward were both, opportunists. It's not uncommon for Lincoln to walk over to Mr. Seward's house. And that's interesting in itself. That house on Lafayette Square. How many people have ever been to Lafayette Square across the street from the White House? It's a big park there. It's kind of cool, a lot of houses. Some of those houses that were there in 1863 are still there, including this one. This is the house that William Seward lived in, another view of that same house. It was one point called the Washington Club, and that's where Dan Sickles would shoot Philip Barton Key as he was walking across Lafayette Park, who was having an affair with his wife, Teresa. So interestingly enough, Francis Scott Key will die in one of the club rooms of that house that later became Seward's parlor. So I just love these little connections, right, between the folks here in Gettysburg and Washington and the Lincoln administration. Lincoln, of course, had a sense of humor. This is just one example of the many, many, many humorous stories he told, including those about Seward. Once Lincoln and Seward were riding in a carriage, the horse bolted. The driver regained control, but he was screaming and cursing and swearing. And Lincoln said, "Driver, are you an Episcopalian?" He said, "No, I'm more of a Methodist." He said, "It's interesting. You swear just like Secretary Stewart, and he's an Episcopalian." So, enjoy the 19th century humor. This is Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury. Very much like William Seward, he too wanted to be President of the United States. But even more than William Seward, he was willing to undermine Lincoln to get what he wanted. He was from Ohio, United States Senator, a somewhat radical abolitionist at the time when that radical abolitionists were attracting some favor. Some people would presume that he would become the presidential nomination in 1860, but Simon Cameron would rob him and all the others of that nomination. They were never cordial. While Seward and Lincoln will develop a close relationship, Chase and Mr. Lincoln were never cordial. In fact, Lincoln thought he was, put his fingers in where they didn't belong, an advocate of emancipation. But interestingly enough, Joe Hooker had Salmon Chase's political support, and that's one of the reasons he became appointed as the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. And then later, Hooker was relieved of duty after Chancellorsville, and Salmon Chase was pretty unhappy about the whole thing. Chase wanted to be president. while he was Secretary of the Treasury, a position that, by the way, Simon Cameron originally wanted, but Lincoln didn't want Simon Cameron anywhere near the money. So Simon Chase becomes Secretary of the Treasury, but throughout his time in office, he's working hard, not only at doing the job of Secretary of the Treasury, changing the financial affairs of this country, issuing greenbacks, the first paper currency in this country. But while he's doing all those good things, he's also working really hard behind the scenes to make sure that he's the next president of the United States. This is an interesting illustration of Lincoln cleaning house over the course of the war. He would replace people occasionally. This is an interesting illustration of some of the people that Lincoln is anxious to replace as he cleans house. You can see an illustration up there as William Seward knocks Benjamin Butler off his pedestal over there. Over here, you can see George McClellan being swept out of the way along with John C. Fremont, who ran for president in 1856. But my favorite part of this whole thing is this little bird cage. You can just barely see it up there. But if you look really closely at it, it's Salmon P. Chase. All right, we're gonna box him in and then we're gonna get rid of him. There's Salmon P. Chase's on the greenback currency. You know, he revolutionized the financial system of the United States, produces the really first federal paper currency. Up until this time, paper currency was available, usually called script, produced by local banks. But this was the first effort really to bring all of that together under the federal umbrella rather than individual state banks, like the Middletown Bank in Pennsylvania that was controlled by Simon Cameron. He had his picture on Middletown Bank currency, but that's not going to work for us. We need federal currency, and we'll put Simon P. Chase up there. This is an interesting illustration of Simon P. Chase, again, just to put some, you know, this is just that kind of the cool stuff of history, right? This is an interesting illustration of a painting of Simon P. Chase and Abraham Lincoln discussing political affairs, discussing the operation of the Treasury of the United States. And I thought this was kind of a cool image. And then I thought it was really cool this summer when I went to Boston, Massachusetts, because I found that same painting in a bar in Boston, Massachusetts. At the Langham Hotel in Boston, Massachusetts, that painting is still hanging today. And Boston has absolutely nothing to do with Salmon P. Chase, but I think it's pretty cool that this painting from the 19th century is still hanging up in a bar in Boston, Massachusetts. Home of the American Revolution.
There's no limit to the research that you're willing to do.
That's right. Leave no stone unturned. Well, you know, it wasn't only Salmon P. Chase that was trying to wrest the presidency from Abraham Lincoln, but Salmon P. Chase had a daughter named Kate Chase, considered one of the most beautiful women in the world. And while Salmon P. Chase was a widower, when he came to Washington, he needed essentially what he had hoped to be his first lady, and he would select his daughter Kate to occupy that position, so that when he became president, his daughter Kate would take care of the affairs that a first lady might undertake. She became known as the Belle of the North, but she too worked behind the scenes to get the Republican nomination away from Lincoln with her many charms. One of Chase's many offers of resignation was accepted by Lincoln in 1864 upon the death of Roger Taney. Interestingly enough, the week before Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg, the week before, he went to the wedding of Kate Chase to a man named William Sprague, who had been a United States Senator. So here you have Simon P. Chase actively working to take the presidency away from Abraham Lincoln. Here you had Simon P. Chase's daughter actively working to take the presidency away from Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln is a big enough man to go to her wedding the week before the Gettysburg Address.
Well, that's politics.
Yeah, that's politics, isn't it? War is politics. And that's what it was, right? Lincoln's smart enough to know that's where a lot of the big wigs in Washington were going to be, and that's where he wanted to be. He didn't want Chase and his daughter to take anything away from his own.
Well,
process.
Chase had to invite Lincoln. He had to invite the president.
Right.
That's right. Now, interestingly enough, they had to invite the president's wife, but she didn't go. But she didn't go. Mary
Oh, that's
Todd Lincoln
Mary.
didn't go to the wedding. This is William Pitt Fessenden. He's going to replace Salmon P. Chase. Now, Salmon P. Chase is going to work hard to undermine Abraham Lincoln. Because of their many disputes, Salmon Chase will offer to resign over and over and over. And finally, Lincoln will accept his resignation, much to the surprise of Salmon P. Chase, but will later appoint him as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So again, he recognizes the talent, even though he doesn't appreciate the rivalry. But he'll be replaced by William Pitt Fessenden. We already talked about his connection to the first vice president of the United States. He was involved in political intrigue. Seemed like nobody liked William Seward in the cabinet, so everybody's trying to jockey into the position that William Seward was enjoying, as he was enjoying a much closer relationship over time with Lincoln. But you know, in similar fashion, Abraham Lincoln once asked William Fessenden, "You are an Episcopalian, aren't you, Senator?" When Fessenden admitted he was, President Lincoln replied, "I thought so. You Episcopalians all swear alike." So it's a story that he would or a version of that same joke he would repeat over and over and over in a variety of sentences. This is the man who will replace William Fessenden as Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Hugh McCullough, educated at Bowdoin College. Who else was educated at Bowdoin College? Joshua Chamberlain. Who else was educated at Bowdoin College? His statue's on Cemetery Hill next to Winfield Scott Hancock. Oliver Otis Howard. And who else went to Bowdoin College? This is going to shock you. The new mayor of New York City, Mondami. He went to Bowdoin College. Did you know that? Now, keep that quiet, all right? That'll stir up a lot of controversy in Gettysburg. But Bowdoin College, and if you've ever been there, is an amazing educational institution. Among other things, they sponsored some of the very first polar expeditions to the North Pole. And they have a whole museum there devoted to the polar expeditions, and not necessarily to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, although you'd think that that's the only thing they ever did. Of course, Chamberlain did become president of the college. But Hugh McCullough was an Indiana banker, and that's worth noting. Because when Jefferson Davis formed his cabinet, he formed it in a completely different way than Abraham Lincoln. And it's worthwhile thinking about that for just a minute. And we talked about who was in Lincoln's cabinet. William Seward, who wanted to become president. Salmon P. Chase, who wanted to become president. Simon Cameron, who was rich and well-known senator, who wanted to become president. Edward Bates, who we haven't talked about, who was well-known and famous, who wanted to become president. So Lincoln is looking for talent, despite the fact that they were his rivals. That's the whole point of Team of Rivals, that Lincoln was looking for talent. But Jefferson Davis was looking for geographic representation. So rather than being concerned as much about the talent of the people he brought into his cabinet, he was much more concerned about where they were from. So he makes sure that there's representation from Virginia. He makes sure that there's representation from Alabama, Leroy Walker. He makes sure that there's representation from Texas, John Reagan. So Jefferson Davis, in an era of states' rights, has states' rights on his mind when he forms his cabinet, but Abraham Lincoln has talent on his mind.
Well, wasn't that the Confederacy's excuse for leaving the Union because they wanted states' rights?
They wanted states' rights, and that's going to blow up in their face.
So that was them all over.
Because Jefferson Davis is never able to form a strong, cohesive federal government and an army that's able to defeat Abraham Lincoln. But there were, of course, more to that story too.
But then on Lincoln's side, wasn't he trying, he was very astute politically, so wasn't he also trying to keep his enemies under his thumb?
Absolutely, yeah. They keep your friends close and your enemies
Right.
closer. Absolutely, it very much would have appealed to Abraham Lincoln. Hugh McCullough. This is the Attorney General. What does the Attorney General do in an administration? What is their job? Pardon? The law. The law. Be a little more specific. What else does the Attorney General do? Interprets the law.
Prosecutes.
I believe the Attorney General would have had the power of prosecution, But mostly their big job is to argue cases before the United States Supreme Court. That's their most important job. Argue cases before the United States Supreme Court. Edwin Bates would be given that. But his tenure as Attorney General was notable for inconsistency of his legal judgments. Interestingly enough, there was also an Attorney General in the cabinet of Jefferson Davis. There was also an Attorney General in the cabinet of Jefferson Davis. His name was Judah Benjamin. But there never was a Supreme Court in the Confederacy. There never was a Supreme Court in the Confederacy. So the Attorney General had even less to do than they had in the Lincoln administration. He had 17 children, that's just fine, which I find interesting. He had black hair and a white beard. And Abraham Lincoln said that's because he used his chin more than his head. He was promoted by Horace Greeley, which would have tortured Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln wanted to be president. Bates wanted to be president. Horace Greeley would support Edwin Bates, which would drive Lincoln nuts and continue that rivalry among the news media and Lincoln. He opposed slavery, but didn't like black people. I guess it's not inconsistent. And he resigned in 1864 because he didn't have a whole lot to do and he wasn't very good at what he did do. James Speed, of course, we mentioned him briefly, the brother of Joshua Speed, Abraham Lincoln's really only good friend throughout his lifetime. So his brother James Speed becomes the Attorney General that gives Abraham Lincoln someone in Washington, D.C., to whom he's relatively close, Lincoln's oldest friend, and he would defend the policies of Lincoln. Montgomery Blair, we talk about Secretary of State, we talk about the Secretary of Treasury, we talk about the Attorney General. Just briefly, let's talk about the Postmaster General. But before we do that, why don't we stop and see if you have any questions or comments?
Go back to Hannibal Hamlin. We assume that Lincoln picked Johnson because he was a Southerner, but he was loyal to the Union.
Yes.
So back then, was there a political calculus to choosing the vice president?
Certainly. Certainly, he's concerned about New England representation from New England. All right. And Hannibal Hamlin is going to neatly fill that slot. Although interestingly enough, he also brings Gideon Wells into the cabinet, who's from Connecticut. So he's also a New Englander. So he's got plenty of political support in those states. But yeah, there is a calculation. He's not oblivious to the fact that he wants political representation, but that is not his modus operandi. Mostly he's looking for people who have the talent to make the decisions that need to be made and have the political support.
Regarding the Gettysburg Address, I'm not sure Lincoln wanted to go, but what was the political expediency for him to be there?
Why didn't he want to be there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a political choice, I'm sure. But I don't think he really wanted to go, and he only had a 2-minute speech, so.
Yeah, he's in Gettysburg for 25 hours to make a two-minute speech, right? So why did he do that? What is your thinking? And I'll give you my own thoughts on that. Why would he have gone? I think he did want to go, by the way. I think he did want to go.
I think it gives them a chance to clarify the real purpose of the war.
All right, you can clarify the real purpose of the war. What were they fighting for up until that point? Union, right? So he wants to send a message that we're now fighting for freedom. He's already issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Why else would he have wanted to go there?
Capitalize on a genuine Union victory.
Capitalize on a genuine Union victory. He did that before, right? After the Battle of Antietam, which he'll call a Union victory, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He sees another opportunity to capitalize on an important victory, even more so. Why else? Why else would you want? You want to be with the soldiers, right? The soldiers have just fought a desperate fight, so he wants to show support for the military. He wants to show support for the widows and orphans. All right.
Well, it's close by.
What's the line from his second inaugural, right? Where he discusses taking care of the widows and orphans. What were you gonna say?
Well, Gettysburg wasn't that far. It wouldn't take him too far from the the planning for the war and so on.
Yeah, he rarely left Washington, D.C. during his war years. He rarely left Washington, D.C., maybe a dozen times. But Gettysburg is you can get to Gettysburg and back again. Right? So it's easier than some other places to get to. course, the newspaper is gonna be there, right? He knows that the newspapers are gonna cover the event. Right, so he wants newspaper coverage, he's a politician, yes.
Yeah, I think you could almost think of it as putting out feelers to see how 64 is going to be. Because right now, 63, he's got that. Grant's got Mississippi. There's a whole hell of a lot of fighting going on. People thought, oh, it's gonna end. Meade doesn't take out Lee. So what's now? You have a 4-month period of thinking. So for Lincoln, it's like, let me put my head up and see what I get out of this small speech. Just an inkling to see what the next year is gonna look like.
Yeah, it's a small speech, and the reason it's a small speech is because he wants newspaper coverage. Edward Everett speaks for 2 hours. What, does anybody know the speech? Lincoln speaks for 2 minutes. We all know the speech. He wants it in the newspapers. He wants people in Chicago to read it. He wants people in New York to read it. He wants to get his message out.
But when he was invited to Gettysburg, he wasn't invited for a big speech. He was asked for a few appropriate remarks.
Which is exactly what he did, made a few appropriate remarks. Wrote the speech in Washington, DC, and then rewrote it, and then rewrote it, and rewrote it. And as you're probably aware, there's 5 different versions of the Gettysburg Address in existence. 2 were written before he gave the speech, including the one that he may have held in his hand, and 3 were written after he gave the speech. Rewrote the speech after he delivered it, because he was selling copies of that speech to raise money for the war effort, for charity, for charitable purposes.
What is interesting that he said little will be remembered from what is said here. But the exact opposite happened. It's a psychology of, you don't expect much from me. And I don't even know if he thought his little speech would do anything, but it went rampant.
But we know that after the events of Gettysburg in Washington, DC, he had made several speeches. And there are allusions to those speeches in the Gettysburg Address. If you look at some of the speeches he made in the summer of 1863 and read the Gettysburg Address, you can see where some of that language might have come from in earlier versions of the speech. What else? Why else did he come to Gettysburg? Well, it's a political rally. It's a political rally, right? Who's there? Right? A lot of his former supporters, Republicans. He's now forming the Union Party in 1864. So he's beginning to think about bringing in his rivals into Gettysburg.
But a lot of sad people who lost people would have been there.
A lot of people.
Because it's a cemetery.
Yes.
So people wanted to go.
Certainly, local people and family members wanted to be at the
It's a
cemetery.
terrible time.
Pardon?
It was a terrible time, so I guess they would have wanted him to rally them or give them some.
Yeah, today we call that comforter in chief, right? So he's fulfilling that role. Absolutely. But who else is there? Who's Edward Everett, right? He's from Massachusetts, president of Harvard University, former Secretary of State. But why did Lincoln invite him? Or why was he invited, more to the point, or why was it important that he was there? Because he ran against Lincoln in 1860, right? Remember, there were 4 different people that ran for president in 1860, and you know who they were, right? Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, John Bell, and John Breckinridge, right? Those are the 4 people. But the vice presidential nominee for the Constitutional Union Party, John Bell, was Edward Everett, right? So in Lincoln's calculation, right, here's somebody, one of his rivals that he brings to Gettysburg, right? And while Lincoln's at Gettysburg, he's going to spend a lot of time glad handing, talking to people, currying favor, trying to gain political support. So he's in Gettysburg as a politician.
So why did they invite Everett? I mean, he's an orator, I guess.
He's a famous orator, but also Lincoln's all too happy that he's there. It may have helped orchestrate his being there. But because he had run against Lincoln, Lincoln wants to bring him into the fold, part of the Union Party rather than the Republican Party. We'll settle our differences later. Lincoln was an outstanding tough politician. Behind the scenes. So Montgomery Blair, we already talked about Montgomery Blair, a one-time Democrat. An opponent of emancipation, as would have been many Democrats at the time. His father was particularly important. Francis Preston Blair. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., across the street from the White House, there's a building there called the Blair House. Maybe you've seen it, where dignitaries visiting the president stay today. That building was named after his father, Francis Preston Blair, who was an advisor to Andrew Jackson on down. And then his son would become Postmaster General. 23,000 post offices. Confederacy seized the post offices. Mail between the North and South was officially banned during the war, but soldiers could send letters without stamps. So I'd send you a letter. I didn't have to pay the postage, but you did. But you know, when you start digging a little deeper into the personalities of these people, you realize people like Montgomery Blair had important political backgrounds, among other things. He argued the case, the Dred Scott case, before the Supreme Court, declaring that blacks were not citizenship, and the whole Blair family was political. This is interesting, a little factoid I came across. You might remember that during the invasion of Pennsylvania, Jubal Early of the Confederate Army burned the Caledonia Iron Works. Well, Jubal Early wasn't done burning things. In 1864, he burns the home of Montgomery Blair in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's called Falkland at the time. This is William Dennison. We talked about him briefly, and he replaced Montgomery Blair. William Dennison's claim to fame is that he's the person that selected George McClellan to take command of Ohio militia forces early in the Civil War. As a result of his military prowess in West Virginia, Abraham Lincoln would make him commanding general of the army. So
Is Denison College named after him?
I suspect it is. I'd have to do the research, but I'm almost certain it is. I talked about a little bit about Simon Cameron. We can spend all evening talking about him. A very important politician, first Secretary of War. Thaddeus Stevens, the great Lancaster attorney, once said that Cameron would not steal a hot stove. Cameron was upset and said, "Okay, you would steal a hot stove." There's the Caledonia furnace. We could spend all night talking about Simon Cameron. Unlike Lincoln, you know, who was all too anxious to curry friendship, or at least bring people in as a political associates, Cameron would never forget a friend or forgive an enemy. Accused of abuses, financial misdealings, lining the pockets of his friends, and so on. There's Cameron's home in Harrisburg. How many people live there?
Cameron Street.
The home of the Dauphin County Historical Society. Being here at the York County Historical Society, your next trip should be the Dauphin County Historical Society to see the former home of Simon Cameron. Interestingly enough, Cameron was so influential that his son would later become Secretary of War, James Donald Cameron. With all these connections. I want to just move forward a little bit. We can't end our conversation without at least mentioning Edwin Stanton, originally a Democrat under the Buchanan administration. How many people have been to Wheatland? Buchanan's home. Oh, great. I love going there. Stanton would replace Simon Cameron and was very instrumental in helping Abraham Lincoln ultimately win the war.
Was he the one that gave Grant so much trouble?
Yes. Well, and Andrew Johnson and Grant, I suspect, yeah. Edwin Stanton, again, that's a presentation in and of itself, an important Secretary of War from Ohio, former Democrat, turned Lincoln supporter. Like so many others, frustrated by the president's humor. Stanton called him a damn fool, and Lincoln's response was, "Well, then I must be one." Because Stanton is always right. There's it, there they are, the telegraph officer receiving what I refer to as T-mails. There's Edwin Stanton's home in Washington, DC. Was Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy, known as Father Neptune, along with William Seward, was only, looked like it then, one of only two people who would actually continue throughout the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in his cabinet. Would build the United States Navy during the American Civil War. And famously was responsible for the ironclad navy that the United States Army would ultimately employ to beat the Confederacy. Calvin Smith, I won't spend a lot of time there. He was in office for a very short time as Secretary of the Interior. By December of 1862, he resigns. He dies shortly thereafter. But as Secretary of the Interior, you're concerned about the Indian problem, the American Indians. That's where you spend your time and attention. I always think it's interesting that when Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg, he brought the Secretary of the Interior with him. Perhaps because he didn't have a whole lot of time on his hands, but probably more importantly, because Abraham Lincoln was not only concerned about what was happening in the Confederacy, but he's also concerned about what's happening out west. So he brings the Secretary of the Interior with him. He pushed for the colonization schemes and for former slaves. Send the slaves back to Africa. James Harlan is the last one we'll talk about. He actually doesn't join the cabinet until Lincoln's dead in May of 1865 under the administration of Andrew Johnson. James Harlan replaces John Usher as Secretary of the Interior, but I believe only because this. Mary Todd Lincoln knew that there was a relationship between Senator Harlan's daughter and her son, Robert Lincoln, right? So his daughter and our son are having a relationship. So therefore, it's very important that he give him cabinet position. That's interesting little stuff. There she is, Mary Harlan Lincoln, Robert Lincoln's wife. And with that, we'll end with the words of Abraham Lincoln: I distrust the wisdom, if not the sincerity of friends who would hold my hands while my enemies stab me. Right? There certainly was a team of rivals, but Abraham Lincoln was able to bring people in to support his administration and ultimately win the war. And with that, we'll come to a conclusion with the words that 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And with that, I'll end our program. Thank you very much. Any final questions? Anybody have any final questions or any comments? Maybe you want to add your own insights or correct the historical record. What else?
I was just gonna say about the selection of the vice president, especially at the first convention. Lincoln wasn't involved at all. It was all done at the convention. It's all stuff that was.
Lincoln wasn't even at the convention,
Right.
but he had his representatives there. Exactly right. Yeah, I think it was unseemly for the candidates to actually appear at the convention. Right. Pardon?
They ran separately.
No, they'll run as a ticket, Lincoln and Hammer. Yeah. What other comments or thoughts do you have? Or
So how many of all those people that used to go for one's part of this?
how many were there? I don't know. We'd have to go back and count them, right?
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. So there's a lot of people in and out. So it's a team of rivals, but the team changes over time.
Is that more than other counties?
Now, Jefferson Davis had a much greater revolving door. More people were in and out of the Confederate cabinet than Lincoln's cabinet.
Did Lincoln have any Southerners?
No, although you might say that Edward Bates was from Missouri, you might consider that And of course, Lincoln was from Kentucky, so, but there was nobody from the deep south.
I'm thinking it was a small cabinet. Much smaller than it is now.
Yeah, there's a lot of, there are positions now that are in cabinet that weren't then necessarily, but then then the country's 300 million today, then it was 30 million,
Exactly.
right?
Joe, you talked about how so many people turned over. Were they leaving on their own, or was Lincoln just, I mean, I'm sure he didn't publicly say they're fired. Was he behind their leaving, or?
Yeah, Salmon Chase, Lincoln engineered Salmon Chase's departure from the cabinet. That was clearly engineered by Abraham Lincoln. Other people like Cal Smith died in office. So a combination of circumstances led to the turnover. Now, interestingly enough, I don't think any of the people in Lincoln's cabinet became an officer in the army, but an awful lot of people in Jefferson Davis's cabinet would join the Confederate Army and lead troops in battle, people like Robert Toombs and Leroy Wilkins.
Well, Jefferson Davis, he was in that, in the Mexican War.
He was in the
Was he
Mexican
wait,
War.
he was a general or something, wasn't he?
He was leading Mississippi troops in the Mexican War.
Did he want to be president, or would he have preferred to be a general? In the Confederacy?
Well, while he was president, he had previously been Secretary of War, so he meddled in the affairs of the War Department and with the military. I think he would have been just as happy to have been general himself or have been
That's what
Secretary of
yeah.
War. Sort of a military tradition in this.
Well, Lee reported to him every day, and I think that was to keep Davis off his back.
Or his politics.
What was John Hayes' relationship?
Well, John Hayes and John Nicolay were secretaries of Lincoln. They had served him in his legal career in Illinois, and they came to Washington, D.C. with Lincoln, and they would act as his secretaries. They would prepare some of his correspondence, rewrite some of his speeches, maintain the files, and accompany him on many of his travels. And then, of course, he would later write about their experiences later in life.
Was it that Stevens that accused Simon Cameron of? Well, did you have the comment about the
About the hot stove?
Was it Thaddeus Stevens?
Yeah, that was Thaddeus Stevens. He once had a law practice in Gettysburg, and then later moved to Lancaster. Became the most powerful man in Congress in 1863, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and then was very involved in the abolition of slavery and the impeachment of Andrew Johnson because he was failing to follow the thinking of Lincoln. So, thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving, all right?
Very well.